everybody, and welcome to today's video. I want to use this video today to talk briefly about a game that is, well, it's not a whole lot as a game, let's put it that way, but it has reminded me of a topic that I have thought about quite a bit in the past and probably talked about on this YouTube channel at least once before, and it is the question of why do we not see more games that are based on literature? The game that I've been playing through is called Masim, the Phantom of the Opera, and I will have a review up on digitallydownloaded.net at some point as well. It's not a great game by any means, as you can probably see from this footage, and my review will go into it in more detail, but it's not great is the point. But I actually enjoyed it enough in a way because it is based on one of my favourite books of all time, and from an academic point of view, seeing how they've adapted the book to the video game format has been interesting. And again, it has raised this question, why are so many of my other favourite books not used as material for video games? Before Andrew Lloyd Webber turned Phantom of the Opera into a thing that people tend to roll their eyes at, it was a Gothic masterpiece from 1910, and it really has it all. There's this thing that's stalking around an opera house, killing people. There's a beautiful woman that believes that an angel of music is watching over her, which is obviously not going to be the case. It's got horror. It's got this really exotic, glamorous setting, and it's even got fan service. It is damned good material, to be blunt. And putting aside that musical, which I do have issues with, there have been a dozen really good adaptations of this thing for cinema in particular. And yet, over in video game land, there's this Masim here, which I'm playing now. And from a Google search, I see that there has also been some hidden objects game that has used Phantom of the Opera, and a point and clicker from back in 1993, which was apparently alright, if a bit buggy. It's not something I've played. But that is not many examples of the Phantom of the Opera in the world of video games, and I would have expected from such a great work of influential literature to have a bigger role in the world of video games as well than it has. Phantom of the Opera is by no means the only example that I can think of here. See, while the video game industry does love to churn out games from pop fiction like Metro and The Witcher, the absolute trash that Tom Clancy wrote, and Lord of the Rings, although I do think that Lord of the Rings had more to do with the films than the books, because before the films came along there were not that many adaptations of the books into video game formats. Throughout most of the history of video games, in fact, it has been really quite mute about taking what we would generally categorize as literature and putting it into a video game format. So for some other great examples, Shakespeare is hardly the influence on games that he has been on every other form of art out there. And it's not like game developers are clamoring to recreate Jane Austen's books or turn Wuthering Heights into an Otome visual novel. Atticus Finch has never been partnered up with Phoenix Wright, even though that would be a great game. And we've yet to see anybody give Holden Caulfield an open world to wander around and be miserable within. These are all great characters and books and masterpieces of literature that most of us have read, and yet there are no video games that are based on any of it. And the real question for me is why? Is it just because these books aren't action enough for the world of video games? If that's the case, then we've got two problems here. Firstly, it's a really sad reflection on the creativity of game developers that they can't figure out how to make a compelling game out of material that isn't filled with action when that material is of the quality of Wuthering Heights or Shakespeare or Catcher in the Rye. It's ridiculous that they can't figure out a way to make it work. It's also a sad reflection on the games industry itself, in that it only sees the action books as appropriate material to drive a game. Unless it's got action, the video game industry doesn't seem to be interested, and that is an issue. And you look at the novels that do get turned into games, and that does seem to be the underlying reason here, let's be honest about it. The Witcher, Metro, Lord of the Rings, and Tom Clancy, they're all excellent books. Well, Tom Clancy's books are not. The others are all excellent books. But they're really memorable in a lot of ways because they are filled with these action set pieces that are very easy to turn into video game material. whereas some other notable examples from the same genre don't get turned into video games. So for example, we're not seeing many Thomas Covenant fantasy games, for example, because Thomas Covenant wasn't really known as a series for its action set pieces. Likewise, in the Japanese games industry, when we look at Asian literature that has been adapted into video games, you see Romance of the Three Kingdoms pop up a lot, thanks to Koei Tecmo, of course, and it is, of course, filled with a lot of action. But there hasn't really been an effort, as far as I'm aware, to adapt a Dazai or Soseki's work into video games. If there is, it's very much Japan only, and I just haven't come across it. But these great authors of Japanese literature aren't really appealing to video game developers either. Now, all of this, like I said earlier, does suggest something a little unpleasant about the video game industry. It suggests that the only area where there's creative development going on is in action sequences, and if the developers aren't working with action, they don't know what to do when adapting a book into a video game. But it also suggests something that's quite unpleasant about modern culture that we have. These books just aren't popular enough to turn into games. If enough people were asking game developers to make Wuthering Heights into a video game, then Wuthering Heights would be made into a video game. It would just happen because there would be a clear market for it. The fact that it's not means that there is no market for it. If you want a clear argument that Shakespeare and the Bronte sisters and Frankenstein are only read these days because they force kids to read them at school, it's the fact that nobody makes video games out of them. Because video games are obviously the entertainment media that is most resonant with the younger generations these days. The game developers see that there's more money to be made out of Tom Clancy's name than the Bronte sisters, and that suggests where people are at in terms of their reading habits and their engagement with literature. Okay, so here's the thing, and I know I've said this before, but it remains very relevant to this topic. Video games are an art form. We all acknowledge that when it suits us, and we love to celebrate the most artistic games when they come along. We've got an entire award ceremony that, in theory, is there to celebrate video games. I spend so much of my time, and I'm not the only one, rabbiting on about games like Nier and whatever because they are artworks. They are very clearly artworks. We also get very upset when certain people from outside the industry actually criticize video games for their lack of artistry. So when Roger Ebert, for example, a fair few years ago now, but when he came out to say that video games are not an art form, there was a big pushback against that within the video game community. We don't like people suggesting that our games are not art, and we don't like that because they are obviously art. But the thing is, and this is a big but, if video games are an art form, then that means they play a critical role in shaping our culture, just as literature has, and so has cinema and music and all the visual arts. And because video games are perhaps the most popular art form around the world these days, they have a disproportionate effect in shaping that culture. And we have a problem here, because when you get to the crux of it, people aren't that interested in engaging with video games as art forms. And that is the first time that that has ever happened across any of the artistic media. The reality is that a lot of people would rather be playing shallow, time-wasting action things or treating games like sports, as in esports. But because they're playing games and because games are an art form, they get some kind of legitimacy in engaging with the arts as doing so. But they're not really. If you're playing Fortnite, you're not engaging with the arts. You're playing an entertaining game, or potentially a sport, depending on how you want to see it. But you're definitely not engaging with the arts. But because Fortnite is a game and games are art, there is the perception there that these people are somehow engaging with the arts, but they're not. Now, this Phantom of the Opera game, to get back to that, may not be that great, but I think the real reason that it won't get people buying it has very little to do with its quality as a game, and has a lot more to do with it being an interpretation of a narrative with that focus. And while it is inherently interesting in cinema to see how literature is adapted into film, and where narrative remains something to be analysed and discussed in film, and a big part of the enjoyment of the work comes from doing so, video games that challenge players in that way, that really ask them to think about the game that they're playing as an artwork, are generally seen as not focusing enough on the entertainment side of things, and are generally overlooked as a result. Now, as always, there are exceptions to the rule, and there are plenty of very smart video games out there But even then, in a lot of cases, in most cases, they are smart for the way that they work within the world of video games. What is intensely rare are games that engage with a broader range of thought as an artwork. So whether it's a lack of engagement with entire art movements, so for example, when was the last time you played a game that was based on the ballet or opera, or it's a resistance to adapt any novel that isn't fixated on action, the video game industry does like to claim that it's an art form without actually engaging with the arts on any meaningful level. And I find that concerning because, again, video games are a dominant art form, the dominant art form, and their star is only growing higher. If people are spending all the time playing these things and that is treated as enough of an artistic experience for them, then we are missing out on a lot of thought, a lot of analysis, a lot of creativity, and it becomes very insular and shallow. The video game industry may yet have a very shallowing effect on the arts, and we need to be very aware of that. Anyhow, that's enough of this video. Like I said, I will have a review of this Masim Phantom of the Opera up on digitally-downloaded.net soon enough. Otherwise, let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, happy to have a chat about this and a robust debate if people disagree with me. If you do enjoy my videos and the way that I do these things, please do click that like and subscribe button. That way you'll get them all as soon as I upload them. And if you do want to support what we're doing on digitally-downloaded.net, please do consider backing us on Patreon. You can do so from just $1 a month, or you can, of course, donate more if you'd like, but every cent that you can give us will certainly help us to continue to grow this channel and find new and interesting things to do and talk about. Otherwise, thank you very much as always for watching, and we will see you at the next one.